And welcome back to Game Escape, here today to review Virtua Fighter 2 for the Sega Saturn, one of my favorite console fighting games, and I think a game that is overlooked and underappreciated on the console. Now I just want to say to my subscribers out there, thanks for bearing with me. I know I haven't done a review in a while. I had some computer issues, motherboard got fried, so finally back up and running, and spring is upon us. And I wanted to talk about this game because I just associate it with that sort of transition period between winter and spring. Virtua Fighter 2 was a game that I think really wowed a lot of us back in the day when it came out. I believe it was 90... Well, I think the first one came out probably in 93, and maybe this one a year later in 94, and it really was a technological masterpiece. And certainly back in the arcades, it was a game that really stood out compared to Street Fighter, compared to Mortal Kombat. And to me, it even seemed to stand out relative to Tekken. I sort of always preferred Virtua Fighter to Tekken. That's just sort of a personal thing. But despite the fact that it was so visually impressive, it wasn't really competition for Street Fighter, at least sort of in my circles. And I've talked about that before, how Street Fighter was kind of the main event when I was going to the arcade with my friends in the early to mid-90s. And if you couldn't get on the Street Fighter machine, which really was the case a lot of times, you had to do other things. So for me, that was usually, as far as video games, was either Neo Geo, some of the Neo Geo cabinets, or later, after the release of Virtua Fighter, it was Virtua Fighter and also Pinball. I talked about that in my iOS Pinball review video. But there was something really special about how fluid the game was. And, you know, back in the day, back before 3D sort of became the norm in games, this definitely seemed like an incredible achievement, and a game that, you know, you had to get on and play. And I had a friend who had a birthday in March, and we would usually go into this one particular arcade. It was a fairly big one up in the Northeast. It was called Sports Park USA, and I don't know if anyone remembers it. If you live in the New York, New Jersey area, at least as I remember it, was a really big arcade floor, and they had tons of machines. And I always remember back after this game came out, we'd be in that arcade. He'd have his little birthday party. Everyone would try to play Street Fighter, and for whatever reason, no one would be on Virtua Fighter 2 and the original Virtua Fighter. And that's what I would do. I'd go and really try my best to play those games. I wasn't very good back in the day, and that's how I would spend my time. And so I really associate it with, you know, March, end of March. It was just part of the ritual, as it were, for a couple of years there. And I was so surprised when I picked this up on the Sega Saturn. This is a really solid port, and it's a game that really did 3D pretty well, I think, for the time. You know, the Saturn is constantly bashed for having really inaccessible hardware for developers, for not really grasping where video games were going, and not really being a capable 3D machine. But in this case, this was a game that I think was expertly crafted for the Saturn. Anyone who's followed the technology around the Saturn knows that it had two processors, one of which they slapped in there very late to compete with the specs on the PlayStation. And that was one of the things that made the Saturn so hard to program for. This is one of the few games that actually takes advantage of that. Basically, each fighter is controlled by one of the processors, and as a result, I think you have a very fluid, very clean game that really stands up to this day. one of the things that should be pointed out is that this game is much, much easier than the arcade game. I actually went back and played the arcade game. I sort of found it at a sort of old school arcade place around here, and wow, is it challenging. I then downloaded it. You can download the arcade port on Xbox Live, and it is, of course, very, very true to the arcade cabinet, but very difficult. Here you have a game that's very accessible and a lot of fun. It's kind of a bare bones title. It just seeks to get the gameplay right, and I think in a lot of ways to correct the horrid release that was the first Virtua Fighter. Basically, they packed in Virtua Fighter with the system when it launched. The system, as you know, was kind of rushed to market, and that game was so bad that they had to patch it and create a Virtua Fighter remix, which still isn't great. This game, however, feels very, very faithful to what you played in the arcade, difficulty aside, and it is certainly an achievement that the Saturn was able to do that. I put these 3D graphics kind of on par with, say, Super Mario 64. Of course, Super Mario 64 is much more, I mean, it's obviously a totally different type of game. The world is much more lush, but turning this on in 2014, it obviously looks dated, but it doesn't look, you know, unplayable. It doesn't look just like a sort of blob of pixels. It still, I think, plays well. I think it still captures that iconic Virtua Fighter look. The game itself, it's one of those games that kind of needs no introduction. It is an absolute classic. Very, very simple control scheme. Punch, kick, block. And it has kind of a rock, paper, scissors mechanic where blocks beat strikes and throws beat blocks. And, you know, it's one of those games, you know, much like Street Fighter, that's very simple. This may even be more simple to pick up and play than Street Fighter, but there's a lot of complexity underneath the hood, and it really will take, I think, a lifetime to become a true expert at the game. The other, I think, standout here is the music. Music in every level sounds great. Obviously, the Saturn music is not maybe as impressive as certainly the arcade port on the Xbox 360, but these are all classic stage themes, and every time I hear them, it's just a pleasure. It just takes me back to that time period, you know, when this game was new in the arcade. There's not a ton of modes on the Saturn release. Basically, you have an arcade mode, you have a versus mode, you've got a little training mode, and then an expert mode that's unlocked when you beat the game. Object of the game, of course, is to make your way through each fighter, and then you fight some sort of metallic woman named Dural, or at least I always thought Dural was a woman, who basically incorporates a lot of the different tactics of all the fighters that you have to beat to get to her. I mean, it's not a huge roster, but it's a classic roster. All of these characters, to me, stand out, have stood the test of time, and are incredibly fun to play. I got this console release fairly late, very late. Actually, I had not owned a Sega Saturn back in the day, so I started collecting for the Saturn about 3 or 4 years ago, and oddly enough, I got my Saturn in, I believe it was early March. And of course, it's actually, in a way, it was sad because I had imported the Saturn first. I got the Japanese Saturn first, ordered it from Japan, and it actually was sent out the morning of the earthquake and typhoon back in 2011. So, you know, it just sort of perfectly fits into this time of year. You know, the air is getting a little bit warmer, and I just feel like, you know, I need to sit down and play Virtua Fighter. If you haven't played it, I would highly recommend it. Is it a system seller for the Saturn today? I mean, should you pick up a Saturn to play this game? I would say not necessarily. I mean, there are other great games for the Saturn, but if you have a Saturn or you're looking to get into Saturn collecting, definitely grab it because it's very cheap, and it actually lays the foundation for so many really, really good Sega 3D fighters. You have Fighting Vipers, Fighters Megamix, Last Bronx, Virtua Fighter Kids, all of which kind of use a variant of this system, and they're just a ton of fun to play. So, like I said, this one I think will always go down in my mind as one of the best console fighting games. You know, it couldn't, obviously, really until I think the days of the Dreamcast, you know, console fighting games really weren't competing with the arcade, but this one came really, really close, and it is still a pleasure to play. So I thank you as always for watching Game Escape, and I'll be back shortly with another video.